Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out on such a beautiful June day here in Cambridge. I'm Anthony Flint, Fellow and Director of Public Affairs here at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and pleased to introduce this final installment of the spring lecture series, which has happily extended into the summer. The topic today is housing, including the idea of permanently affordable housing, a goal that the Lincoln Institute has been working towards for many years. Our primary focus has been on inclusionary housing, where a portion of new residential development is dedicated as affordable, and on shared equity housing and community land trusts, where the cost of the land is essentially taken out of the home buying equation, reducing the price tag and ensuring a future discount through a modest cap on resale profit. But our speaker today has almost single-handedly discovered, investigated, and celebrated an additional frontier that has, in a way, been hidden in plain sight, and that is manufactured housing, representing the largest unsubsidized affordable housing stock in the U.S. Some 8 million families, we are told, occupy such homes, numbers that inclusionary policies and CLTs could only hope for. We're going to hear about all of this from a particularly insightful authority and someone very special to all of us here at the Lincoln Institute, because the speaker today is none other than George W. McCarthy, President and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Mac was named the 5th president of the Lincoln Institute last May, coming from the Ford Foundation, where he was director of the Metropolitan Opportunity Initiative there. Prior to that, he administered a Ford Foundation program that focused on home ownership to build wealth for low-income families in their communities. He's been a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, an associate professor of economics at Bard College, a resident scholar at the Jerome Levy Economics Institute, a visiting scholar at King's College of Cambridge University and University of Naples, Italy, and a research associate at the Center for Independent Social Research in St. Petersburg. He earned a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a master's degree in economics from Duke University, and a bachelor's degree in economics and mathematics from the University of Montana. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the extremely well-traveled George McCarthy.
Thanks, and thanks for coming out. I haven't actually been single-handedly reviving whatever we want to call the affordable housing field's interest in manufactured housing. I had a lot of help along the way, including one of my good friends, Paul Bradley, who's sitting here in the front row, and you'll hear about some of Paul's work, and I'll probably enlist Paul to answer a few questions about some of the stuff we did in the sector. But I have to say that I think I'll speak for Paul. Given the challenges we've had of getting housers interested in manufactured housing, is quite extraordinary that we actually filled the room here today. In 2002, when Paul and I first started on this initiative, we actually working with NeighborWorks America, we put together a symposium on manufactured housing in which we invited several thousand people working for community development corporations, nonprofit housers around the world, around the U.S. And we half filled the room, and we couldn't even find enough people doing actual work with manufactured housing in the nonprofit sector to fill 3 panels. So it's interesting that this has now evoked so much more interest, and it's actually heartwarming. All right, so I'm going to tell you, a long story with a kind of a personal kind of journey here, and it all started about 15 years ago when I was recruited to come to the Ford Foundation to develop a new program for them around using home ownership as a means to help low-income families build wealth. At the time, the Ford Foundation had been working for about 30, 40 years in their anti-poverty work and their urban poverty work, focused almost solely on rental housing and building affordable rental housing. But they adopted a new approach, their anti-poverty approach, called the assets approach, which said that if you really wanted to make durable changes in people's lives, then what you should do is help them to build wealth and not just transfer income from year to year. So with some interest, I came to help start the program, and then I had to suffer the slings and arrows of every affordable housing practitioner in the world who said that the Ford Foundation is now throwing rental housing under the bus, which we actually did. So it was true, but nonetheless, it was just the way things happen. Anyway, so when I came to Ford, and I started to think about the challenges of using homeownership to build wealth, one of the first things I did is I reached out to an old friend of mine who's since passed away, Cushing Dolbear, who worked for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. And I just asked Cushing to give me a little bit of data on where low-income homeowners lived in the U.S. And she went to the American Housing Survey and pulled down some tables for me and showed me kind of the distribution of low-income homeowners, where they live, what they lived in. And I was absolutely astounded to see the proportion of low-income homeowners who lived in manufactured housing. And I was actually astounded to see the scale of the sector. It just absolutely surprised me. I'd been working in housing at that point for about 20 years. And I just had always kind of assumed that manufactured housing was some niche-y thing, a small number of houses that was kind of insignificant in the face of things. And yet I found out that it was actually kind of a gigantic share of the housing stock and an even larger share of the affordable housing stock. So I went and I enlisted the consumer union. Well, back up a second. So I started talking to people in the field about manufactured housing. They said, look, Mac, you're trying to help people build wealth. Why would you be talking about manufactured housing? Because everybody knows that manufactured housing is an asset of diminishing value. And in fact, when you look the way people actually tried to assess the value of manufactured housing at the time, they used a blue book like you use to value automobiles. Because in many ways, everybody was still considering manufactured housing mobile homes, and they had been called mobile homes before 1976, and somehow assumed that because they're mobile homes, they're actually mobile. That's another thing I found out, they're not that mobile. So anyway, so I actually then, first I asked Cushing, I said, can you take a look and tell me, is it really true that manufactured housing is always an asset of diminishing value? And she came back and she said, Mac, it's actually about a third of manufactured housing has been appreciating. But I can't actually explain why. I just can detect that in the data. So I went and asked the consumer union to do some more in-depth study for me. And they actually not only found out how manufactured housing could appreciate, but they were able to kind of unpack it for us and give us some insights into how we might be able to intervene in the sector to make it a better option for people to build wealth. So then, I was kind of talking to some of the folks at the Ford Foundation. I was in the process of building this new initiative, and one of my colleagues who used to work in Vermont said, hey, Mac, you're interested in manufactured housing? You should go talk to these people in New Hampshire. I think I seem to remember they're doing some important stuff there. Maybe you should see what they're up to. So out of the blue, I called a guy named Paul Bradley, who was running the Manufactured Housing Initiative at the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. And I said, Paul, would you mind if I kind of come up and kick the tires, see what's going on up there? I hear some interesting stuff going on up there. And Paul, ever the entrepreneur, said, oh yeah, and he put together this tour for me of manufactured housing and a complete analysis, at least from the point of view of people in New Hampshire, about the sector. And then he brought me to sit at the table of one of their newest kind of acquisitions, a manufactured home community that they converted to resident ownership, to meet Lois Paris, who was a diminutive 4'11" woman who just shined in her kitchen and told me all about her transformation from being kind of stigmatized member of her community to now being someone who is managing a multi-million-dollar asset. And she also kind of introduced me to the community there, and I was stunned to see just the quality of neighborhood that you would encounter in a manufactured housing community, which more than rivaled, but actually surpassed what would I consider the kinds of neighborhood characteristics you would want in a place like the suburbs or in the city. And I said, wow, this is actually quite important. This is something I should take seriously. So I sat down with Paul and I said, well, what are we going to do? And so that's where the story starts. So this is what I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to introduce you to manufactured housing because I'll give you some facts that maybe you know, maybe you don't know, but when I encountered them, I found them to be quite stunning. And I've Actually, I pulled out of the mothballs a presentation I did in 2003 about this initiative, and I've updated the data. But I was actually stunned as I was going through it to see just how much of the stuff we planned to do in 2003 we actually got done, which is quite amazing, right? So then I'm also going to talk a little bit about sectoral theory. I don't know if you know much about it, but it's one of these kind of, it was kind of one of those sexy things people were doing in the early 2000s to kind of fix broken markets, particularly in the workforce development field. But we decided to apply the sectoral theory to manufactured housing, and it was a good call. Paul and I decided that we could really find a way to organize a whole bunch of different actors to kind of really take on the sector. And then I want to talk about what we did, how we actually started, and it's still ongoing work, but we've actually made gigantic strides in transforming that sector into a housing solution and not something that people look at as part of the problem anymore. And I'll just describe some of the key accomplishments of some of our other players in the field. All right, so in the 1990s, manufactured housing accounted for 2/3 of all the affordable housing built in the United States. And from 1990 to 2010, over a course of 20 years, 21% of all new single-family homes were manufactured housing. And 43% of homes that cost less than $150,000. It's a lot of housing. Who lives in that housing? Well, 74% of their owners earn less than $50,000. And the median income of manufactured housing owners is around $29,000. And this was whatever, 2012 numbers. And compared to site-built homes, this is really important. Manufactured housing, the construction cost is less than half. It costs $41 a square foot, and this is in 2010, versus $84 a square foot for just the hard cost of construction of site-built homes. The production time is 80% shorter. It takes a lot less time to build, and it generates about 35-40% less waste in the production process because it's contained. It's in a factory. It's in a setting that you can actually recycle and reuse lots of material that otherwise would just get thrown away on the job site. A lot of people think that this is only housing that exists in rural areas out in the boonies, but in fact, 5% of the housing stock in U.S. metropolitan areas is manufactured housing, and it's about 15% of rural housing. So it's certainly concentrated more in the rural areas. But almost half of the manufactured housing stock, 47%, is in the suburbs. It's about 4 million units of housing. 8% in central cities. That's, I think, pretty significant. And once cited, 80+% of manufactured homes never move. And even of the 18 or 19% that do move, some of them are just moving from where they are to the landfill. So it's not what we consider to be a mobile housing stock anymore. And what's even more extraordinary, people think that, transients live in manufactured housing, but the turnover rates in manufactured housing are only 2 to 4%. And that's compared to an 8% turnover rate of owner-occupied site-built housing. And a 50% turnover rate for renters. Renters move on average once every 2 years. Homeowners move on average once every 8 to 12 years. Manufactured homeowners don't, which must mean that they're trapped in their homes or they like where they live. And since the HUD code, now, the HUD code is an interesting thing from a land use perspective. It's the only preemptive national code, building code in the world. And what it means is that no local authority can forbid or adjust or change or contest the building practices that are approved by HUD through the HUD code that was approved by Congress in 1976. So anybody that wants to build using manufactured housing does not have to comply with local code. Even though places like New York City think that they can prohibit building with manufactured housing, just that no one's ever challenged them in court, but we could if we wanted to. Since the actual HUD code was produced in 1976, the quality has improved dramatically of manufactured housing. So now both the durability and the price appreciation of manufactured housing is approaching that of site-built housing. And of the stock that's out there of the 8.5 million units of manufactured housing, at least according to the census that I looked at in 2014, less than 25% of that stock, a little bit less than 2 million units, are from the pre-1976 days, and those are the things that you normally associate with manufactured housing. And just to show you that by structure type, and this is a little bit old, I was trying to update this data. I couldn't get the data for manufactured homes, but the For non-manufactured homes, in 2012, the median income was $52,500. And for manufactured homes, for all of manufactured homes, it's $30,000, and for manufactured homes in manufactured housing communities, the parks, it's $27,000, which puts you pretty close to about 60% of median income in almost every market in the U.S. All right, so in 2013, we had 8.5 million units of manufactured housing, with about 2.9 million units of people who own their homes but rent the lots underneath them in communities, about 50,000 manufactured housing communities around the country. If you think about it this way, so there's 50,000 communities around the country, there's 3,100 counties. So, on average, we're talking about 17 per county. That's a lot, right? And those are just the manufactured housing communities. A lot more of the stock is just on owned land, on regular lots. But if we compare that to the subsidized housing stock, the entire subsidized housing stock in the United States, which has includes the portable vouchers, the portable Section 8 vouchers, place-based Section 8, public housing, and the rural component of the Section 521 USDA program, which is not a HUD but a rural program. We have 4.9 million total units of affordable housing in the United States, and that's diminishing all the time. Every year we probably lose 100,000 units. So the ratio of affordable housing in the U.S., or manufactured housing and affordable housing, is 1.7 to 1, meaning we have 70% more manufactured housing units, which is almost entirely unsubsidized, than the entire stock of subsidized units. And most of the people who live in manufactured housing would qualify for that subsidized housing. Not that we'd have any place to put them, because right now we have lists. We have so many lists of people waiting for subsidized housing that many housing authorities across the country just close the list. They don't even add people to the list because they say, we got lists that are 3-4 years long. Just to give you kind of a picture of a place that's near and dear to my heart, Montana. In Montana, which is mostly rural state, there's about 60,000 units of manufactured housing, and about 35,000 of those are in about 300 manufactured housing parks. And in that state, there's 13,000 units, 13,700 units of subsidized housing. So the ratio there is 4.4 to 1. In Minnesota, another place that I happen to like, there's 88,000 manufactured housing units and about 90,000 affordable housing units. That's because Minnesota has some of the most generous housing programs of any state in the country. So the ratio there is about 1 to 1. But if we look at other states, look at Arizona. There's 41,000 subsidized housing units in the entire state of Arizona, and there's 305,000 manufactured housing units. A ratio of 7.4 to 1. Or South Carolina with 66,000 subsidized units and 366,000 units of manufactured housing, 5.5 to 1. A couple of states stand out. Massachusetts, which has actually much fewer manufactured housing units, or New York. So there's like a 40% ratio of manufactured housing to subsidized housing. But once again, Massachusetts and New York are also generous housing states like Minnesota, right? So this is what you think about when you think about manufactured housing, I guarantee it. And this is a picture that Paul gave me from a magazine from 1952. And this is the mobile home. And this is what everybody thinks about, because this is a thing that, I don't know, a worker who probably came back from World War II and is looking for work, a welder, jumps into one of these things and travels around the country working at different welding sites, and he pulls it with his car, his pickup truck, or whatever, right? And then we also think of this older stock, and we call metal on metal. And this is the stuff that was built before 1976, before the HUD code was put in place. And this is the stuff that gets pilloried all the time in redneck jokes and everything else. But this is what it looks like today. This is the kind of stuff that's being developed today. Manufactured housing developments all around the country with nice roof lines on beautiful lots. And a lot of these are actually in manufactured housing communities. This is a manufactured housing that was built by Primavera Foundation in Arizona. And it looks a hell of a lot like a stucco building in Arizona, because the manufacturing techniques allow you to do stuff that looks like whatever architectural vernacular you want. And this is a multifamily infill development in Seattle, Washington, that was built by my friend Tony Toe, who you might have met at the journalist forum here in the spring. Here he stacked 4 units and put a pitch roof on it, but each of these units is the manufactured housing unit that he just stacked up. And he was able to prove that even in infill development in a place like Seattle, he could save 22% on his hard costs of construction by using manufactured housing. And what's even more interesting, because he did it as an experiment, they built site-built housing that looked exactly the same next to the manufactured housing, and they brought in prospective buyers, because these are condos. And to a person, the people who went and toured these units, everyone preferred the manufactured housing units to the site-built units because they preferred the finishes. That one, by the way, won an award. It won an Affordable Housing Award back in whatever it was, in the early 2000s. But anyway, so remember I talked about building assets, and building assets was my goal. And so when the Consumer Union in 2001 did this work for me, they told me, well, this is what it actually takes. Price appreciation for manufactured housing requires pretty much ownership or control of the land underneath the unit. If you don't control the land, it's pretty likely that you're not going to build wealth. It also, there's an odd effect, the sales price. The original sales price had a negative effect on the ability to build wealth. And that's because in the old model of manufactured housing, where the housing was sold by dealers, it was sold in the same way they sell cars, and who knows what you're going to pay. It depends a lot on what the dealer's willing to concede and how well you're willing to bargain. But it's not like it's a sale that's at least disciplined by an appraisal and other kinds of forms of cost containment. The problem is that because nobody actually contains the cost, if a dealer convinces you to pay more than you should for the house, then there's a very high likelihood you're not going to build any wealth in it because you paid too much. On the maintenance side, if people actually did more aggressive maintenance, they regained about half of their investment, so 50% on the resale. And then the regional housing market, if the manufactured home is in a decent market, it will track the market by about half. So if the market went up 10%, the manufactured housing would go up about 5%. And then the higher volatility of prices, and this is really important because this is actually something that in my own research we were able to find in almost every low-income market we looked at, that over the cycle of, over business cycles, low-income markets, the volatility is almost twice as high as higher-income markets. And I proposed, my theory for that was that it's just a thin demand structure underneath that market. And if the market starts to collapse a little bit, demand just goes away. And the prices go up really in extraordinary fashion because you get all sorts of speculation in low-income markets. And if you wanted to see how that happened, just look at the housing crisis in the middle of this last decade, where low-income markets, the appreciation was gigantic and the fall was even more gigantic. But then, you know, there's also big institutional problems in the manufactured housing market. I mentioned that the industry was built on this automotive model where the homes are built in factories, they're sold by dealers, usually with in-house financing. They're installed by the dealers, and I put installed in air quotes because you know, installation is, well, let's say it's an art more than a science. And it's inspected on the shop floor, not after installation, right? One of the reasons the HUD code exists is because they say that they can inspect the building quality at the factory, not at the site where it's set up. And unfortunately, most of the problems with manufactured housing happen after setup. And then they're titled like automobiles originally. And they have this little medallion that's attached to the home that's just like a with a serial number that looks like something you would find on the dashboard of your car. Well, the other institutional problems, and this is the big thing, which was the housing itself, especially after the HUD code in 1976, it evolved from being more temporary housing to permanent housing. And it was the kind of permanent housing that's expected to last 40 plus years, but the market structure never changed, right? So production, distribution, and finance was all done as if it were a car. And so, and the defects in that market really led to a gigantic crisis in the industry that happened in the early 2000s that was actually a precursor for the housing crisis that happened in 2008 in the US that spread to the rest of the world. Because really, really shoddy lending standards led to all sorts of, well, in this case, repossessions because it wasn't really foreclosure, and a gigantic stock, a backlog stock of houses that were repossessed. And what happened is it completely diminished any demand for new construction. And then it's one of those things that cascaded on itself. And so this is what happened. Manufacturing housing placements, which are almost 400,000 units in 1999, fell to 50,000 units by 2010. So that's like, this is an industry that's operating at pretty much 20% or less of its capacity. And if you think it's rebounded, I checked the last numbers. Last year, there were about 60,000 placements. So, it's still 20% of its, or less, of its historic capacity. And what's funny is, having now been able to interact with the manufacturers, the dealers, the financiers, and I've been known to call the manufacturers troglodytes at times. The manufacturers never quite figured it out that they were actually captive to their own financing side, which was actually destroying their market. They were cannibalizing their own market. They never quite figured it out. So then the other challenges in the market that we faced, the low regard of the public for the existing manufactured housing stock, which they always thought were like whatever, magnets for tornadoes, or I don't know, whether, redneck Rivieras, right? So, and then new development was hindered also by really broad suspicion. Even if the new developments look like the pictures I gave you before, a lot of people said, if you're building with manufactured housing, then NIMBYs came out like that. They said, no, you're not going to build in my market. And then, we decided we needed to fix the sector to preserve both the existing affordable housing stock, because where are these 8.5 million families going to live if we stop having manufactured housing as a choice for them to live in? And we wanted to enjoy the benefits of new development, because if we're affordable housing practitioners and you can save anywhere from 22 to whatever, 50% of the development costs, why wouldn't you want to develop with manufactured housing with 20% of the production time? But of course, the biggest opponents we met when we started this work in 2002 were people in the affordable housing industry, because they were still of the mind that manufactured housing was part of the problem and not part of the solution. So here's the problems, right? Manufactured housing is not treated like site-built housing. It has weak lending standards, weak protections for owners, no due process if you bought this as chattel with private market lending as opposed to a mortgage, and fewer protections, especially for homeowners in the 50,000 manufactured housing parks where they rented the lots underneath the homes they owned. So they had no control over lot price increases, no protections from displacement if the park gets sold out from under them. And they were just completely vulnerable to displacement all the time. And one of the things that when we started talking to people who were actually the early developers of manufactured housing parks in places like California, this is something Henry George would love, right? Because what they said was, you know what, we bought this land on the urban fringe, and what are we going to do? We need something to do with it while we wait for the city to grow, right? So they put this modest investments in them. They were able to get enough improvements in the land to be able to bring in manufactured housing. They cash flow for as long as they need to, and eventually when the urban sprawl happens, then they just convert it to another use. They sell it to a Walmart, or they sell it to a condo developer, or they redevelop it as other kinds of housing themselves. And because the people who live in that housing have no protections, they just displace them. And they could do it in as little as 30 or 60 days notice. And where are you going to go? Because manufactured housing doesn't move. And it's expensive to move if you even tried. And the problem is that you don't have any place to move it, because most manufactured housing communities don't allow you to pull a used unit in and put it into their park. And then there's the lending market, which was actually the biggest culprit in destroying the industry, but nobody wanted to do anything about it. With these unwarranted lending standards, which were that source of volatility, chattel lending, private, it's like a personal loan as opposed to a mortgage. And no mainstream lender that really wanted to drive quality into the lending industry. And then, the implications of this is that the lenders, what they said was, look, if you made it more like site-built housing, then we would be willing to lend. And of course, the more you make it like site-built housing, putting it on full basements and doing whatever else you can do to make it look like site-built housing, you destroy the cost benefits you get from building it in factories. It doesn't mean you don't have to build lousy housing. It just means that you can't do things like afford to put it on in full basements, although Paul did. Paul did a whole development where he put full basements under manufactured housing units just to prove it could be done. Anyway, but the contradiction with it was this, that even if you treat the new stock as like site-built housing, if there's no resale market, you don't protect the lender from collateral risk. And I talked to lenders till I was blue in the face about this, and they just didn't get it. I said, look, if you're not lending on used units, you only want to lend on new units that are built to site-built standards, how is anybody going to ever be able to sell the house? What if they end up in foreclosure? How are they going to sell the house? No one's going to lend money to sell the house. So you have no demand structure on the resale side. You're going to get no appreciation. You get no collateral protection. Anyway, but the lenders in that, if the manufacturers were troglodytes, the lenders are something that I won't say in public. And the odd thing was, of course, all the lenders wanted to serve the market to the extent that they could use it for CRA compliance, goals-rich mortgages, but only so they could hold them for 10 minutes and dump them off into some secondary market. So Paul and I sat down, and our initial goals were, we need to find a way to engage the sector, to change the behavior of the manufacturers, the lenders, the public sector, and the public. We need to really have 4 targets of our kind of work, and we need to demonstrate effective ways to preserve, develop, and improve manufactured homes. So a sectoral initiative. This is the didactic part of the talk, where I talk to you about sectoral initiatives, which, like I said, were really sexy about 12 years ago. Everybody wanted to do a sectoral initiative, right? But a sectoral initiative is, what's really distinct about it is, well, first of all, you really do a thorough analysis of a sector of the market. You don't try to take on a whole housing market, but you take on a sector, or a whole labor market, you take on a sector, like, I don't know, the service sector, restaurant sectors, right? And you intervene by becoming a valued actor in the sector. So it means you're not one of these advocates who lobs in grenades from the sidelines. Then you say, no, I'm going to prove that I belong in this sector. I'm going to work with you in the sector, and I'm going to find a way to make the sector work better. And the initiative exists for the primary purpose of assisting disadvantaged actors. And this is, of course, why it would merit funding from a foundation, right? And it creates over time systemic change, which is obviously the key, system change. And what you do when you actually develop these sectoral initiatives is you focus on 3 things. Leadership development, where you support and network current leaders in the sector, and I found like 5. We started with 5, we ended up with hundreds, right? Finding, training, and supporting new leaders, and this is why Paul Bradley is here today with some of his cohort, because they're training and they're helping them to improve their work on the ground. And then developing the right kind of outcome and impact measures by crafting kind of discipline methods to really track outcomes and be able to talk about them, communicate them. And then resource development. We're finding sustainable funding relationships with a range of public and private actors, but more importantly, actually finding a way to self-finance what you're doing by building the right kind of business model within your effort. And then seeking and investing deeply in the key frames that lend themselves to a systems approach. So this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to improve the perception of and the treatment of new manufactured housing and manufactured housing owners, the supply. We wanted a better perception of the existing manufactured housing stock. And we wanted better systems to serve the demand side of the market, namely, lending systems, to better fit the needs of the owners in general and low-income owners in particular. And the outputs were we wanted to see manufactured housing treated as real estate at all levels by the buyers, the sellers, the lenders, the appraisers. We wanted to change the perceptions of the owners of manufactured housing, and we wanted to be able to get financial services and expanded use of manufactured housing as an affordable housing option by practitioners. And we wanted to see that manufactured housing was viewed as a normal good, just like any other house, with the right kind of access to financing. And we wanted the public and the public sector to stop telling redneck jokes, right? So that we wanted to have people understand that this is a viable housing stock that matters. And we wanted measurable improvement in the share of manufactured housing that was produced by nonprofit developers. We wanted an increased share of mortgages financed by conventional lenders, decrease the number of manufactured homeowners who rent the home sites underneath their homes, and a decline in the number of owners displaced from their communities because their community owner decides to sell or to change the use of the land right out from under them. And then, of course, on the asset building side, we wanted better financial improvement, better home price appreciation, increased housing wealth, and increased opportunities for home ownership for low-income families. These are the interventions: policy change, long-term site control, high-quality new development, proving the model, and developing lending markets. And of the first 3, I think we knocked it out of the park. On the 4th one, still working on those lending markets, but anybody who's actually ever worked with lenders know that it's a lot of knocking your head against the wall working with lenders. And then we worked with some of our other 5 practitioners that we were able to kind of marshal into our new network to create a national initiative called Innovations in Manufactured Homes, I'm Home, which has its main home at the CFED, which is a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. And this was the strategy. We're going to foster site control for owners and investor-owned parks by converting them to resident ownership, thus Rock USA. Develop effective replacement strategies for older pre-HUD code homes because we're going to want to elevate the image of manufactured housing. Develop high quality lending for purchase, resale, and home improvement. If you can't do all three of those things, you're not going to protect the asset value. Establish better state level policies and create uses of manufactured housing and drive the industry to be better than they actually are. And by the way, at the same time that we were starting to bank on manufactured housing as a solution in the market, somebody else decided to bank on it in the same way, and his name was Warren Buffett. And as usual, Warren Buffett usually looks to me for signals as to what he should be doing. So, and yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, that's what it was. In 2002, it was 78% of all manufactured homes were financed using chattel lending. By 2007, there was a dominance of mortgage financing and an increasing treatment of manufactured housing as real estate in many states. In 2002, we had no uniform siting standards, which is really important because if you don't site the house right, things go wrong. In 2007, after really a lot of advocacy, HUD pulled together a consensus committee that actually developed standards for siting of homes. And then really important, in 2012, the Uniform Law Commission passed the Uniform Manufactured Housing Act to promote titling as real estate as an option for all manufactured homeowners in the United States. And little by little, that's making its way through states and other things. But I don't know if you know about the Uniform Law Commission, but generally, they're 5 or 10 years ahead of the rest of the world, and they come up with ideas about how to really improve laws by making them kind of uniform across the country in important sectors like manufactured housing and other things. All right, so let's talk about preservation of the existing stock. So Rock USA was trying to preserve affordable housing by conversion of manufactured housing parks to resident ownership. And they do this by bringing technical assistance, financing assistance to park residents for permanence. And I'm talking about permanently affordable housing because, and I'll explain to you why in a second, and they're going to bring market capital to the sector. That was their goal. That was their goal in 2001 before they even formed Rock USA, when this was just the brainchild of Paul Bradley at the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. But incidentally, when I went to the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund to work with them, and I was actually underwriting a loan to them from the Ford Foundation, I looked at their performance. And at the time, they'd done about 50 manufactured housing parks, and the way they were financing them was they were providing subordinate lending, so they could bring in a market rate lender to do a big part of the purchase price, and they would come in with like 20%, sometimes 25% of the purchase price in a subordinate position, saying that they were basically going to guarantee the position of the lender in front of them. They'd done 50 parks, and how many of those parks do you think lost any money in any of those transactions? 0. They had a perfect record. I think you still do, right, Paul? Yeah. So. And so I said, wow, this is a community development finance institution that has been lending, I don't know, a couple decades at the time. They've actually been lending to, I don't know, the lowest of the low in the housing market. And yet, in a subordinate position, they hadn't lost a dime. So it's a no-brainer to write a loan to these guys. I was like, I should just give you the money. And Paul said, that's a good idea. I think you should give it to them. So just to give you an idea of what these are, so this is in Carver, Mass., Cranberry Village, one of the more recent conversions. This is a manufactured housing community, and you can see just a little bit of the housing. It looks like it could be on Cape Cod, any housing on Cape Cod, right? Now, I don't know, how big is this one?
278.
278 homes in this community, and I think you guys are still really happy to be running it yourself, right? Unadilla, New York, Paul and I wrote an article. Where did that end up in? Oh, Democracy, and this was featured there. This is a park in upstate New York that was going to be lost in foreclosure, and these guys hustled and got the residents organized and were able to purchase the park in, that was less than 60 days, right? Yeah. And Red Lodge, Montana, once again, one of my favorite places. Another park that they were able to convert from likely sale and loss of land because it was going to be converted to condo development. And instead, these fine Montana homeowners were able to buy the land and manage the park and run it themselves. So New Hampshire Community Loan Fund in 2002 had converted 50 parks with a perfect record, 50 and 0. And by 2009, they were at 113 communities with about 6,000 homes, which, by the way, was more than 20% of the market in New Hampshire. And importantly, when we started talking to appraisers and others in New Hampshire, they'd already created a systems change because the appraisers said when they're appraising a manufactured housing unit, they don't use a manufactured housing unit in a resident-owned park as a comp for a home that isn't in one, and vice versa. Because they said that they'd already been detecting price differentials as much as 22% in the resident-owned parks because the value of those parks was much higher because people had control of the land under their units. And then Rock USA provides technical assistance and other support to park conversions now in 20 states because, of course, I found a successful thing in New Hampshire and I said, well, let's blow it up and take it to the whole country. And Paul said, oh, maybe. And so now he's doing it. And he's at least I think they're in 22 states now. And they've got a $100 million park preservation fund where they're doing really creative stuff now, selling participations to a bunch of different lenders in the sale of parks, and they're starting to bundle multiple parks that they're going to try to find ways to create REIT-like structures to be able to get financing in there. And to date, they now have 170 resident-owned communities around the country with more than 10,000 homes. And so when did you guys start this?
2008.
In 2008. So in Anthony mentioned that we really care about permanently affordable housing in places in like community land trusts. Well, the community land trust work has been going on for 40 years, and they're just closing on about 25,000 units nationwide. These guys have gotten 10,000 in just a few years, and it's important to consider that the trajectory here is much faster, and this is affordable housing, unsubsidized housing, and is permanently affordable in the parks because the parks, when they convert them from investor ownership to resident ownership, they create a non-profit cooperative with completely limited equity. So basically people buy in with a $500 share, and that share stays the same forever. And then they can sell their home on the market for whatever price they can get, and they transfer the share for $500. They don't make any money on their share of the park. So it's like a land trust because the land is basically held out of the discussion. And if they decided to shut the park down and sell it to an investor, they couldn't keep the money because it's nonprofit. They'd have to distribute the money to some other nonprofit in the same state. So basically, they've tied it up as permanently affordable housing in perpetuity. Good thing. So then replacement. So now, you know, these pre-HUD code homes from before 1976, which are pretty dilapidated, generally energy sieves, not so good. And the actual reason that people have kind of a low perception of manufactured housing need to be replaced. So another person in our network who actually came reluctantly to the network, she was running a nonprofit CDC in Kentucky. She hated manufactured housing dealers. She hated manufactured housing. But she was getting her butt kicked by the manufactured housing people when she was trying to put low-income people into site-built housing. And she said, why is it that they can put somebody in a house in 60 days and it's taken us 6 months? So she looked at the sector and she said, well, maybe I'd better do something different. And what she did was she decided to find ways to get really high-quality manufactured housing produced by one of Warren Buffett's guys and have them delivered to her so she doesn't have to buy them through dealers and have her begin setting them up. And I'll show you some of that housing. So that's not it. This is what you call a Kentucky double wide, right? Where actually they took two different units and they plunked them together. And honestly, I was in this house. The guy took a chainsaw and cut a hole between the two units and then put some caulking and stuff in between, and they made it into kind of a double wide unit. And he had a family, I think there were 5 kids living in there with their parents. And there's the parents, and I think the 6th was on the way at this point. So Frontier Housing, Stacy Epperson is the entrepreneur, decided to help them replace their home. And this is a home that they brought in where they put on a foundation. And I didn't get the final pictures, but we had some final pictures. It's an extraordinary home. But you see, it looks like any kind of suburban development. It even has eaves. It has a pitched roof, right? This is another home in Kentucky that was a home for a single mother with 4 kids. And they were living in it. And as you can see, it was originally the metal on metal. And someone had gotten kind of creative and started to put wood around it to kind of protect it from the elements. That's the back of it. There's a couple of the kids on the porch. That's the front of it with an added porch. That's the house that replaced it in 2006. And there's the kids having ice cream on the porch. So then, what about high quality lending, the other intervention we're trying to do? And like I said, in 2002, the two largest lenders in the sector went bankrupt. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac jumped out of the market. There was almost no bank activity. And in 2006, as a result of strong kind of advocacy from some of our partners, the FHA passed the Manufactured Housing Loan Modernization Act, in which they started to at least provide loans for people who complied with Title II standards and a bunch of other kind of hoops that FHA made them go through. And so today, FHA represents about 20% of that lending market. And then in 2007, with the help of Paul and others, we were able to mount several demonstrations of effective lending for purchase, resale, home improvement, and refinance of manufactured homes that the performance of those loans rivaled the site-built sector. And so today, now we have continuing demonstrations of manufactured housing done right, built right, set up right, and as it turns out, the lending performs as well or sometimes better than the conventional mortgage markets. But in 2012, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau estimated that still 68% of manufactured housing purchase loans are what they consider to be high priced. They fall into a very specific category because of the pricing of the loans. And that compares to about only 3% of loans for site-built housing that would be considered high priced. So people that own manufactured homes are still paying too much for lending. But now we're getting some state housing finance agencies involved, some credit unions, but most of the people have to be content with holding the loans in portfolio because there's still almost no secondary market to sell these mortgages. All right, what about new construction? Because obviously, the other side of the coin was we wanted to get the affordable housing practitioners to understand that manufactured housing could be part of the solution. So next step, the company that Stacey Epperson founded when she left Frontier Housing decided that what they're going to do is they're going to be an intermediary that is going to be able to provide high quality Energy Star manufactured homes built for them to their specs by the manufacturers who basically came to this with some reluctance and eventually finally kind of complied. Now they're seeing this is probably the largest growth sector in their industry. And she's networking with nonprofits around the country to start building these high quality homes. This is one of the homes which is, I'm not sure if this is, wait a minute, no, that's it. This one is actually called by, so Clayton Homes, Kevin Clayton, who by the way is owned by Warren Buffett, named this home the Stacy. Right? Yeah, so that one, that's in their catalog, that's the Stacy. This one has another name, I can't remember what the name was. But these don't look exactly like the mobile homes of your parents' day, right? And inside, they're actually quite nice because she has them designed to universal design standards. It's another one with another nice kind of kitchen, living room. Looks kind of like a, I don't know, regular old single-family detached house. And then after Superstorm Sandy, while a lot of people were sitting around trying to figure out what they're going to do, Next Step came and put 17 homes in less than a month in vacant lots in manufactured housing parks to start housing people who had been displaced from the storm. First responders, and they've actually now developed a whole set of products to give them first response to disasters. Which, and by the way, disasters don't only happen to manufactured homes. A lot of people in high-rise rentals got displaced by Superstorm Sandy. So, all right. So what do we get for successes? Resident ownership now is spreading with activity in more than 20 states with the help of ROC USA. New manufactured housing developments with the help of Next Step Housing is working in 16 or more states. And they're experimenting now with mortgage lending facilitated by nonprofit organizations in more than 7 states. We couldn't get, I think we got 120 people out of the thousands we invited in 2002 to come in, nonprofit practitioners to come in and even talk about manufactured housing because they were so hostile towards it. In fact, we had disruptive people who came in and disrupted our meeting because they needed to tell us just how bad manufacturing housing was and why were we, the Ford Foundation and other nonprofit practitioners, trying to advocate for this stuff. And now we've got literally hundreds and hundreds of people in these networks that are using manufactured housing and trying to preserve manufactured housing and trying to lend to it and doing it right and actually making money. So, just to review our sectoral approach, we'll have a quiz on this later. It's a distinct intervention model that exists for the primary purpose of assisting disadvantaged actors in the sector to succeed. And I have to say that the work of I'm Home and the partners, Rock USA, Next Step, has done exactly that. And what they've been able to do is show that there are coincident interests between the owners of the homes, the lenders for the homes, the manufacturers for the homes. And if you can find ways to kind of align those interests, it can actually work out for everybody. What a win-win-win. We all like that. And a distinct intervention model that creates over time systemic change within the sector. And right now, I'm Home, Rock USA, Next Step, they're transforming the manufactured housing sector, improving that manufactured housing done right can compete with site-built housing in every way, and it can be actually a preferred option for low-income homeowners who otherwise wouldn't have access to the housing market at all, and would likely not have access to the subsidies they need otherwise, because they can get on the 3-year waiting list for in almost every state in the country. So that's the story. So thanks, and really we have Paul Bradley right here who can also answer questions, and if there's any kind of questions or comments you would like to make them now, because you won't have much of a chance. We have about a half an hour, I think.
Thanks so much for this lecture. It's been really fascinating. Are there any defined differences between manufactured housing and modular housing?
The biggest difference between manufactured housing and modular is that manufactured housing is built to the HUD code, and it has to be ready to be occupied before it leaves the factory. And it leaves the factory on its own wheels. So it has a chassis, it has wheels underneath it, and it gets pulled to the site. It can actually be set up on the site sometimes just by moving it around without a crane or anything else, although a lot of people are placing them with cranes now. Modular housing actually has to be built to local code. And it's not complete until it's brought to the site and set up, and then it has to be inspected there. So the cost savings of modular, which are sometimes substantial, aren't as big as the cost savings for manufactured. And to the extent that people are hostile towards factory-built housing at all, there's nothing you can do to defend yourself in the modular world, because NIMBYs can keep you out, and your local code can keep you out, while the HUD code is preemptive and it will allow you to do that anywhere. So,
just to get an idea of where the stigma starts. Suppose I got good credit. I want to buy a house. Can I go and say I want to build one of these units and get a mortgage, or that's not possible?
Depends on where you are. In some places you can. In New Hampshire you can, because in New Hampshire your title is real estate. Once it's affixed to the ground, its title is real estate, and you could get a mortgage. In many states, they don't even allow manufactured housing to be treated as real estate, and if it's not treated as real estate, you can't get a mortgage.
Could you?
What's that?
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
Name one state that doesn't.
Minnesota.
Minnesota has a statute that allows you to convert a manufactured home that's personal property and title.
Only if it's on your own land, not if it's in a park or in a not if it's in a if it's in a development. It's only if it's on your own private land.
Or a long-term lease.
No, not in Minnesota.
But
and there's at least, let me see, there's almost 20 other states in which there's no real process for converting the title from chattel to real estate. I'll refer you to the CFED site. They have a list.
Can someone who's can you go in and just buy the unit? Say, I want one and have it delivered. Do you have to go through a dealer?
So the average person, if they're going to buy it, they're going to have to go through a dealer, right? And because it's still the retail part of the production model, just like cars, you don't usually go to the factory to buy your car, right? But with the work of like Next Step, they've now negotiated direct relationships with the manufacturers, and they don't have to go through dealers, right? And the thing is that the manufacturers feel like in some ways they're tied to the dealers because they need them to be their retail presence, and if they started selling outside of their dealer networks, the dealers would revolt, right? So, so you have to actually go buy one through a dealer.
I'm interested in your observation about the GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, pulling out of this market. I know by the 80s and 90s they were kind of dominating conventional lending in terms of volume and especially standards, and they were paying a lot of attention to manufactured housing. And then the period 2002 to 2007, where your slide showed a lot of transition to entitled real estate. I don't know if this is coincidental or not, but that's kind of the period where Fannie and Freddie kind of went in the tank and dropped their standards down to join the subprime sharks.
Yeah, but when Fannie and Freddie dropped their standards, they did it in the Alt-A market. The Alt-A market was with very high credit people who they just didn't disclose their income, or they didn't necessarily need to qualify with full appraisals and stuff. But Alt-A market didn't apply to manufactured housing. Those are usually big loans, right? But those are the things that took Fannie and Freddie down.
Well, I guess my question is, their withdrawal from the market, I mean, this is really critical because they could be a huge ally for you if they were with you. Was it targeted? They decided to actually withdraw from manufactured housing, or was it because they set standards or restored a level of standards that they could no longer take the kind of loans that were being submitted? No,
so basically what happened is, so they were interested in really kind of getting into that market in the 90s for a couple of reasons, right? Because of their affordable lending mandates and other things, right? But then when that market started to tank, and remember it tanked about 10 or 8 or 9 years earlier than the rest of the market, the performance was so bad that they didn't want to be they didn't want to be participating because they just saw the performance going down. When Conseco went out of business and Greentree was
bought by Conseco.
Oh, it was got bought by Conseco and went out of business. So they started saying, well, maybe not. But you know what's funny is they were still buying them, really. And they were even buying chattel, even though they weren't supposed to be. And they were bundling it up with alternative stuff. So they were doing it, but they would much rather actually, given that they're going to be in the market, they would buy the chattel because it was priced so much higher. So if they're going to take the risk, they figured, why not get a risk with 500 basis points more in the interest rates? So that's one of what they were actually doing. And what they didn't do is what they did for the conventional market, which was to establish the conforming standards for the secondary market that drove quality into the primary market until they stopped doing that, and then everything reversed, right?
But do you need or can you get a strategy to get them back? I can't see them discriminating against this if it has potential loan quality.
Well, when they come out of conservatorship and people really try to decide what they're going to be and who they're going to be, there's a pitched effort to get them to serve this market, right?
Sorry to digress a little bit, but I thought one of the samples you showed was 4 pieces put together. Was I wrong?
Yeah, that was the multifamily here.
So how was that one different than modular?
It was built with HUD code homes. They were all pulled to the site. He put them in place with a crane and then added the pitch roof on top. But he was just experimenting to see if he could save money in the construction. And basically the money he saved, he was in Seattle. These had to be produced to a specific seismic code. But what he really saved was he displaced his labor costs from the Seattle market to where the units were produced, and they just put them in place. And the only labor he had to incur was the team who came in and put in the pitched roofs. So that's where he saved the money, right? And it was odd because when you go up, he had the 2 almost identical looking units beside each other, one that was manufactured housing, one that was site built. But when you went up the stairs and the one that was manufactured housing, you realize that the stairs are like 1.5 feet longer, and you're trying to figure out why. Well, it's because when he stacked them, he still had the chassis in between, so that the thing was a little bit taller, right? And so the stairway was bigger, but big deal, right? It was built to work that way, and they locked together. The whole design was really nicely done, and the factory that produced them did a very good job of making sure that they interlocked in the right ways and the halls between them worked right, and it was actually quite interesting. Yeah.
Just a couple of historic notes and then an observation. I was a community development director in Orange County, Florida in the mid-'70s, and I'm talking home ownership here, but we had a manufactured housing producer that worked with us when we instituted the Section 8 program. It was really quite effective because their rents were lower and met the Section 8 levels. It was pretty good. At that time, I found out partly through them about the HUD initiative in the late 60s, which strategically probably was the biggest institutional effort in manufactured housing. That was Operation Breakthrough that Romney started, actually, George Romney. who came out of the automotive industry and thought,
Oddly enough, yeah.
if we can apply those principles, we're going to lower the cost of housing. I think the project at HUD failed because actually the cost of housing dipped in the early 70s, and they found it was no longer applicable. But the 76 code, I think, came out of that effort.
Right, yeah.
But the people that I worked with in Florida, Cardinal Industries, I think it was, I don't know if they did manufacturing or much like, they said we wouldn't go into the Northeast. They came out of Ohio, were successful in Florida because of geography. You know, they had a lot of site availability, and they were able to plop package plants in their own subdivision and then create the housing. So I would guess that most of the housing that you represented as affordable is in states that are probably in the Midwest and Mid-South.
So the biggest states that I showed you in terms of the number of manufactured housing units, I think in order, are Texas, California, and then South Carolina. And so you're right in the South, but it still represents a pretty good share of the housing stock. In fact, just let me go back to that slide because I'll show you that not all of those are southern states that we had in the slide, and I have the data for all 50 states, but I don't. Yeah, Texas has 755,000 units, right? Almost 10% of the entire stock in the country. California has 518,000. South Carolina has 366. North Carolina has a lot too, but you see like Arizona and Alabama have 300,000. But look at Michigan. I mean, there's 246,000 units in Michigan, which is a pretty cold state. It's been cold when I've been there sometimes. There's still 195,000 units in New York, and Paul and I visited a couple of different plants in New York that were producing housing up in by Syracuse. Let me see, Massachusetts only has 25,000 units, it's not very many. Colorado, 93,000. There's 60,000 in Montana. So, and most of the factories now are regional, so they'll ship within at least a 500, 600 mile radius, and sometimes even further.
I had a question about the zoning and permitting process for the Carver project, how that was done, if it was an existing project that was replaced, or if 40B was used, or how?
You can ask the lady right behind you, she lives there.
It was an existing community, the resident bought it.
And why did you have to buy it, right? Because what was going to happen to that park?
The owner was selling it to ELS, which was an investor, and people were very frightened the rents would go up. So they bought it. It was a very quick thing. It happened in just, I don't know, what was it, Paul, about 3 or 4 months?
Sure.
All of a sudden, we owned it. It was quite shocking.
Yeah, I think part of the sectoral initiative goals needs to include working on local zoning code to allow, especially in this state, which has such, restrictive zoning when it comes to affordable, even multifamily housing, that I think it's probably, in its own way, discriminatory to manufactured housing.
See, as it turns out, though, this is why the preemptive HUD code is important, because you can't be prohibited out of a market, but you'd have to sue your way in, though, and then you have to decide, is it really worth the cost of coming in, right? Yeah. Martine.
How competitive are the manufacturers of these houses? And have there been, over time, gains of efficiency from technological advances there, or materials or whatever? Are the costs going down? Or?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, these guys are scientific in terms of being able to track the use of labor, the use of materials, all that on the shop floors. They're very, very good at improving process. In terms of whether the industry is competitive, not so much, because they've basically carved up the country into regions that different manufacturers serve, although there used to be, there was a lot of consolidation, especially when the crash happened in the early 2000s, where some companies went out of business, some other get swallowed up. But right now, it's like 3 or 4 big ones, right? Three, yeah. So it's an oligopoly, really, and they don't necessarily compete with each other on price so much as they compete with each other on home styles, home types, and all that.
But I'm curious about you said that they tend to be overpriced. People tend to, so this means that they probably have some fat there.
Well, no, it's the manufacturers aren't the ones who negotiate the price. This is the problem. It's like a car, right? So what I said was that whether you can build wealth by owning a manufactured home or not depends on how much you spent originally, right? And the problem is that we looked at the variation for the same units in the same market, and we started looking at, and the price variation could be as much as 22%, right? And it had everything to do with the willingness of the buyer to kind of negotiate with the dealer when they went in. If they're a good negotiator, they'll get a better price, and if they're a bad negotiator, they get a higher price. But the more you paid, the less likely you were to be able to build wealth, because if you overpaid. And the problem is that it's not a disciplined market. So like in a real estate market where at least the transaction is in some ways disciplined by the request for an appraisal, the oversight of 3 or 4 different eyes, because the lender is not going to let you pay too much. Your parents aren't going to let you pay too much. Everybody's going to be looking at that transaction. You're sitting in a showroom of a dealer. You're waiting for delivery of the house maybe in 6 weeks. You're negotiating a price then. They come and set it up, and then it's up to you to even fight with them about the quality of the installation and all that. So it's kind of a different deal, right? And that's why it was really important for us to find a different way to get the housing on the ground. And we said, look, a mission-driven organization that wants to produce affordable housing and do it cheaply, why aren't nonprofits in the space, right? And of course they weren't, because they looked at the space as toxic. And until we finally gave them gas masks and get them in there to look at them, they said, oh, geez, these aren't toxic. These are kind of nice. And next thing you know, they're wanting to develop with them. And they realized they could shorten their development timeline. It was really helpful for them, right? But anyway, it's a crazy broken up market. And institutions just never evolve as quickly as other things evolve in the world, and they have to be forced to evolve. And like I said, the manufacturers were living in caves. They just didn't get it, right? And they didn't see how they already destroyed their market by being captive to chattel lenders, right? They just weren't willing to kind of even think at all entrepreneurially about how they were going to change their business model, except for one, Kevin Clayton. Well, actually, the other guy, Joe Stegmeyer, too, right?
Well, Clayton's done the most integrate financing, right? So
right.
Now control too big finance.
Right. That's the thing. Warren Buffett owns now the largest financer of manufactured housing in the country as well.
I work a lot with some folks that provide housing for the homeless. And the multi-family unit again that you put up there really intrigued me. It was actually corridors and stairs were created when the modules came together to allow access to the upper floors. Has that been explored, and do you know? And for
in the 14 years that we were doing this work, we actually worked with only 2 that I remember. There was Oakland, and then there was Tony at Homesite. So in these high-cost markets, Oakland, California, and in Seattle, they were building multifamily and multi-story units using manufactured housing. And I don't know why they were willing to take on the challenge of working with the designers, making sure that everything kind of fit together, and then doing it. In Oakland, they said that they were saving 30% on their costs. But remember, it costs a hell of a lot of money to build in California. I could never even understand why, but like the affordable housing developers are saying their production costs were like $500 a square foot or something, right? It's like, oh, well, who couldn't do better than that, right? So,
is there? I mean, you've been talking about buyers, dealers, and markets. Has the architectural world come in here somehow? Architects, designs, schools of architecture.
So there have been some wacky architects who've designed some really cool and wild-looking manufactured homes, but those are like not affordable, right? And in fact, Alex was telling me before, the GSD at Harvard, they did a thing on mobile homes, right? And these guys created these really, really cool designs. In fact, I have a book, maybe it's up in my office, with some of the designs, but they were expensive. And now there's some people who are still doing this stuff, and they're using it to build kind of whatever wacky houses out in the woods in New Mexico or something, right? But those are for wealthy people who can afford to, buy these really, really stylishly designed things.
It's so intriguing, the possibilities, and I think in the last couple of questions, of low-income housing or affordable housing, and it seems like an opportunity. This seems like the kind of stock that is developed frequently in suburban areas. That's what you showed. Is next step, or are there other groups? Is there any way to spread the gospel? You mentioned California, for example, and the whole nonprofit housing industry mindset. Could a, say, bridge housing get involved in acquiring sites and developing at a larger scale or at a large scale? In other words, could we open up a whole sector, which I know is beginning, but
Right.
is that a possibility? Are they so wed to the very expensive low-income housing tax credit model of rental that they can't really see this as a possibility?
Yeah, so that's interesting because when just before I left Ford, I was actually talking to Kevin Clayton about that specifically because he wants to open up the LIHTC market. And he was trying to find LIHTC developers, low-income housing tax credits, developers who would actually use his homes. He wanted to set up one of his factories specifically to make plug-and-play kind of modular homes or even manufactured matter he could use to build up to 5 stories for, like Hope 6 redevelopments or anything else that would be using low-income housing tax credits. And he had found a couple of smaller developers, but these were kind of rural developers using LIHTC in, I think it was in Illinois or in Kentucky.
Mac, what I meant was drop that. In other words, we've got, as you know very well, a sector that's basically building very expensive housing for low-income people. It's expensive to build. It's packed with all sorts of expenses and fees and so on. Here's a model, as you really established, that is or can be produced inexpensively, and you could get sites, suburban sites, greenfield development, if you will, or maybe brownfield development, where you get sites and build, let's call it subdivisions. We don't need to go upstairs here. We could just do inexpensive, low-income subdivisions by mission-driven nonprofits or for-profit.
Well, that's what Frontier did in Kentucky, and the developments they built were kind of like suburban, subdivisions, and they looked exactly like suburban subdivisions, except they used manufactured housing, and they were doing fine, right? But so I did actually talk to Bridge about this, right? Yeah, and what Bridge said was, look, we got Davis Bacon, we got all these other things, and the first time we start trying to offload our labor costs to a factory out in the eastern part of California and start bringing in these houses, the unions are going to be shutting down our sites, right? And they said so they didn't want to endure the brain damage of trying to go in that direction. And probably in as locked the market as San Francisco, that makes sense, right? But there's other markets in which it would be probably useful. The problem is you got to get people who are kind of entrepreneurial enough to take on the challenge and work through the experiments. Because like Tony Toe in Seattle, right? He did a half dozen of these kinds of developments like Noji Gardens. Then he stopped because he said, you know what? I got to go higher. And in a high earthquake zone like Seattle, I can't go 5 stories with the manufactured housing. And he went to modular and he went to other kinds of things to do his new condo developments. But I mean, I think that the opportunity is there if someone wanted to really figure it out. And that's what Kevin Clayton wants, is someone to figure it out to just do these big, 5-story plug-and-play kinds of things. Right?
Mac, maybe just add on that, which is to say that where the new production folks, the developer folks have gone is really into replacement of existing primarily, so more of that work could lead to more entrepreneurs and to look at other
once it's established,
greenfield developers.
Successful mode.
I think so, and much like us, we're a preservation-focused organization because there are 50,000 communities. And by the way, the most resident ownership in the last 7 years has been preserved right here in Massachusetts. Over 1,000, close to 1,200 homes now in resident communities, and another 700-800 homes in the pipeline for preservation in Massachusetts. So it's really been growing tremendously. We also get approached by folks and frankly, mobile home park zoning, which is essentially high-density detached single-family housing. So small homes on 10,000 square foot lots. There's tremendous density bonuses and affordability because of shared services and smaller frontage, fewer feet frontage. Tremendous cost savings of doing a manufactured housing community development and then over site-to-build subdivisions. So there's real opportunity there. We're not going there directly, some of our members might. but because there's so much work to do in preservation. But the more we can just lift the cap off of this and people can see opportunities, I think we'll get there. It's too slow.
No, but Paul, you did go there because you built Barrington Oaks. Right?
Yeah, we did Pepperidge Woods, which was a
Pepperidge Woods.
44-site community, which we put double-wide, multi-section manufactured homes on insulated concrete form foundations, some 4 foot, some 8 foot. And those properties, that properties performed very well. That was a case in point. Had we approached that 25-acre site with a site-built residential subdivision, we would have built 8 homes. Instead, we put 44 manufactured homes plus a community center on site there. So really remarkable density bonus for dealing with zoning.
Yeah.
Just getting back to the wood and the nails again. In Massachusetts, if you take one of these homes and put it on a concrete foundation, 8 feet, backfilled, excavated, completed, per square foot, what are we ballparking costs?
What did it cost you for?
Yeah, those for the 8-foot foundations, they're approaching $160,000. Those are late 2000 prices.
But per square foot?
So those were 1,300 square foot homes. So someone do the math for me.
150.
I hate doing math in front of groups.
140.
Off the top of my head.
More than 100 square foot. But you know, the average site build cost now is higher than that.
And where it was built, that was a very inexpensive purchase price.
Yeah.
There were
Yeah.
2 towns from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, so.
Right, yeah. So it's a very nice, strong market. Yeah.
So my question really is a follow-up to what I think you were talking about, Paul, and that is that, well, first of all, Susan and I represent a lender and Mass Housing Partnership. So we have lent to a couple of permanent financing for a couple of mobile home parks in Massachusetts. But what we experienced, not only in the 2 parks that were existing parks, where we were the permanent lender, what we've experienced is issues both with the condition of the properties, but also with infrastructure. And, you know, we do technical assistance, we hear from a lot of communities, the more rural communities where there isn't water and sewer often, that the parks are becoming essentially obsolete because of failure of septic systems, and current code doesn't allow you to replicate what you have. So I'm just curious about your experience, you know, both in Massachusetts and in other states, in dealing with existing stock and existing failing infrastructure, because the numbers don't pencil out.
Yep. So very significant problem. So these are communities that were built. Some is, you know, latest far ago as the 60s, certainly 70s and 80s saw a lot of manufactured home community development, right? And so the aging infrastructure, the water, sewer, electric, roads, and drainage, which make up the improvements in a community, are of those ages. And built at a time when it was a temporary, thought of as a temporary solution. Without a lot of public oversight in terms of, you know, we're not talking six-inch DI lines here. We're talking a 1-inch copper tube to feed 25 homes. You know, this is problematic. So we invest. So in terms of the process of purchasing communities are purchased only after due diligence with a property conditions report that we actually fund before the homeowners make a decision to purchase, so that they have all of that information from a third-party engineer. That's just integral to our process and our values and community development approach. But that said, that capital improvements plan across the country is funded at the time of closing with either reserves or through cash flow. And we are financing a significant amount of improvements in Massachusetts. In North Adams, Mass, $1.3 million has just gone into a complete water and sewer upgrade. Down in North Attleboro, there's $300,000 of improvements. In Middleborough, there's $1 million worth of improvements, all being financed, in this case by Rock USA Capital. Our objective, quite frankly, is to raise the profile of safe and secure resident-owned communities so that public agencies that do hold the resources, such as USDA and CDBG and other state resources, see the opportunity to begin to invest in manufactured housing communities in a safe way, so that that's long-term, permanently preserved and affordable, and see this as a neighborhood and a source of housing to preserve and improve over time. But it's, that's sort of on the public policy, just our public relations work, if you will, where and we empower a lot of community leaders like Colleen from Cranberry Village, empower community leaders to self-advocate. A lot of folks in agencies never thought of this, had ignored this housing sector, or intentionally, or just has not seen it before. But when homeowners show up and say, "Look, this is a significant source. We own this, and we want to improve it." We've had great luck around the country at leveraging resources because it's a compelling story.
And just to say, as Paul says, the residents are purchasing, so they're voting as a democratic group to raise their rents enough to purchase the community and also to do these improvements. So this community in North Adams, I forget what the vote was, but close to 90% of the folks in the community voted to raise their rents initially in order to purchase, and then fully aware and voting for raising them again to do this infrastructure improvement. So, and in Massachusetts, the DEP has really seen resident ownership as a way to address the problem of communities, because that's where there's this great willingness and desire to see that improvement take place. And so there's been some real action, I think, on that part of it.
All right, I think we're running out of time.
This has been a terrific conversation. Let's once again thank George McCarthy.